Hi, I'm Andy Reed. I work with the University of Missouri Extension as a horticulture specialist covering the South Central region. We're here today to talk about composting, and specifically, composting food scraps. Did you know that nearly 20% of the waste sitting in landfills is made up of food scraps? Most of that comes from residential sources. Many of those scraps can be used to compost and place on the soil as an amendment. Now, the Department of Natural Resources and the Ozark Solid Waste Management District have also noticed that statistic, and they partner with University of Missouri Extension to bring you this program about composting. So we'll teach some techniques, we'll talk about some ingredients and what goes into a healthy compost pile, and hopefully at the end of the day we'll all learn something. So grab your food scraps and let's get composting. Today we're going to visit the Salem Community Garden in Salem, Missouri. Several months ago, the master gardeners out of Dent County and myself built a 3-bin composting system out of cinder blocks and T-posts. Today we're going to go back and we're going to visit the setup, and we're going to look and see just how effective this 3-bin composting system can be. And we're also going to talk about some general techniques and ingredients to make a healthy compost that no matter what your system, you'll be able to turn out the best product possible. Composting is a natural process. The breaking down of nutrients. It happens all around us every day. And in our yards, it happens when we mow our lawn. The grass clippings, they get chopped up, they fall down, they decompose, and then those nutrients are returned to the soil for the plants to then again to use again. So it's recycling in nature. And what we're trying to do is mimic that system in our compost. Some great reasons for composting are the obvious reasons. It's going to improve our soil. Now here in Missouri we have, typically in southern Missouri especially, we have a very rocky, a very clayey soil. Now this clay can hold a lot of plant nutrients, but what we have is we find those plant nutrients get bound up in that clay. It's very tight and it's hard for plant roots to grow into. So by adding compost, what we're doing is we're adding organic matter to our soil. Organic matter is very important in our soil. The composting process can also degrade pesticides and plant diseases. When this compost pile heats up, if we have the proper mixture of nutrients, water, and air in that pile, it's going to heat up to a level that will degrade many of these pesticides, and especially things like herbicides that we might put on our lawn that we don't want going onto our garden. By putting that material through the composting process, it's going to degrade that, then it won't hurt our garden plants. What we're really looking for is you have to think about the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Some people will call that the brown to green ratio. But the number we're looking for is about 30:1, is that perfect carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be exactly that to make a healthy compost, but that's the number we're shooting for. And what carbon to nitrogen ratio basically means is the type of materials that are going on there. They're going to fall into one of those two categories, carbon or nitrogen. Some examples of carbonaceous material are going to be tree leaves, straw, wood chips or sawdust, and some of the more materials higher in nitrogen are going to be things like lawn clippings. Most people will maybe put that in the brown side, but it's actually more in the green. There's a lot of nitrogen. Those have the ability to become very putrid on their own. And our food scraps. Food scraps are definitely on the high nitrogen side. We want to treat those as a high nitrogen material and make sure that we have plenty of carbonaceous material in our compost pile in order to break that down. We want to promote a very diverse biological environment in our garden soils. That's what's going to keep our plants healthy, and then consequently we'll get better produce and not have to do as much with pesticides and these types of things on our garden. You might notice if you do a soil test that there's not a test for how much nitrogen is in the soil. Now it will show you how much nitrogen to add. So one of the main factors that determines how much nitrogen to add to your soil is the amounts of organic matter that are there in your soil. So basically what a soil test is testing for is your soil's ability to hold nitrogen, and that's based on the organic matter levels. So the organic matter is very important for our soil. In addition to just loosening it up, breaking up the clay that we have in our soil, it's going to allow vertical movement of water. It's very important. Our soils have the ability to absorb about a ½ inch of rain an hour. So anything over about a ½ an inch is just going to run off the top of our soil. We're not going to be able to use it. By adding that organic matter, we're going to increase the pore space and allow water to sink down deeper into the soil column. Now our plant roots are going to be encouraged to grow deeper, and then whenever we do have a dry time, there's going to be more reserves of moisture deeper in that soil for our plants to use and keep them more healthy. We lose about 10% of the organic matter in the soil every year. So that's why it's important to continue adding compost on an annual basis or even a couple times a year, depending on how much you do to your soil. Tilling our soil is one thing that really degrades the levels of organic matter very fast, because you're adding all that oxygen, you're breaking that organic matter into smaller pieces, so it's going to speed up that degradation process in the soil and require the addition of more compost to the soil. It's very important to pay attention to the mix that we've talked about. That 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is what's very important. Now, you hear a lot to avoid adding sawdust to your compost pile. Most of the negative effects from adding wood chips or sawdust directly to the ground come from a process called nitrogen immobilization. And what's happening in the soil is the microbes in the soil, they use nitrogen to break down that carbonaceous material. There's a lot of lignin, a lot of carbonaceous material in sawdust and wood chips. So what happens is the microbes use all of the available nitrogen in the soil to break down that material, and then it robs it away from our plants, and now our plants don't have the proper amount of nitrogen to be able to grow in a healthy way. By manipulating that carbon to nitrogen ratio in the compost pile, we're able to avoid the problems that would come out of that, because once the microbes use that nitrogen to break down that carbon material, they release them back into the compost, then it can go on your garden and be used by your plants. So the size and the location of your compost pile is very important. And you can see that we've got this composter set up underneath a tree, so we've got some shade on the composter. It's very important to have. And it comes back to your water utilization. You need a good amount of moisture in your compost pile all the time. So if you've got it out in a sunny location, it's going to dry out faster. You'll have to add water to it more often. As far as the size of the compost pile goes, we normally say 3 feet by 3 foot pile is about right. And if you want a larger compost pile, you would windrow that or set that 3 foot wide by 3 foot tall pile into a row. It would be fairly easy to turn, still going to get oxygen down throughout most of that pile. If you happen to be in a sunny location, don't have the option of putting your compost pile in a shady location, you can cover it with a tarp. And that's very useful in order to conserve that moisture. Wet it down, cover it with a tarp. We can think about 3 things that the compost pile needs, same 3 things that we need: food, water, and air. You have to have those in the right amounts in our compost pile. So, what is the proper amount of moisture in the compost pile? Well, to determine the proper amount of moisture, what you'd like is to be able to reach into that compost pile, and when you squeeze it, it's about the consistency of a well-wrung sponge. You might get a drop or 2 of water out of it, but there shouldn't just be streaming water out, and it shouldn't be extremely dry either. The air, how are we going to get the air into the compost pile? Well, that comes by turning, and we'll show this 3-bin system and how well that works to be able to turn your compost over and manage it in a very efficient way. You can see that we've begun some piles over here in the compost. As I turn that over, you can see the bottom, mostly just leaves, grass clippings, things coming out of the garden. And then what we've done is we've added some soil into the pile, and we're going to layer that as we go. Now that's very important to think about with all the materials that you put in. You want those to be well mixed. So if you have a lot of leaves, you'll add a layer of leaves. Then you've maybe got some green material out from plants out of the garden, then you would add a layer of that as it becomes available. But try not to just fill your composter with one item, because then you're not going to have that carbon to nitrogen ratio that we really like to see. So what we're going to do now is just go ahead and add some material to this compost pile. What I've brought here today is just some common kitchen waste. Now you're going to notice a lot of white shavings in there with this. And all that is shredded paper. And what this is doing is it's acting as the carbon material in our compost. Like I said, we need a lot of that in there in order to offset the moisture and all the nitrogen that we're going to have from our food scraps. So it keeps the smell down, keeps it from getting too wet, putrid. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this on, kind of in a layer onto our compost pile. It's just that easy. Just work that around, get it nice and thin. And we want to try it as much as possible, keep that in layers. Now, you might look at that and think, well, it's a little bit too wet still. There's too much food scraps on top. It's really good to bury our food scraps anyway into our pile in order to discourage animals, things like that, from coming and digging it up. So then at that point, you can take some more of the shredded paper, add it to the top of here, and that'll work just fine. What I'll do is I'll go back with a little bit of the soil now, throw that over the top of the pile. So what we'll do is take it from this pile over to the next as it needs turned. So we'll fill this bin up, move it to the next bin. As that bin fills up, we'll move it again to the next bin. By the time we get to our last bin, we're working with finished compost. We've got something that we're ready to put on the garden. Another way, since there are a couple different ways to operate this system, another way would be to just fill up a bin, fill up the next bin, fill up the next bin, and then turn them in place. By moving those the piles from one bin to the next, what you're actually doing is you're aerating while you move that. So it's just two different ways, however you want to operate your bin, your system, whatever's best for your situation. So this system, you can see, made out of cinder blocks. It's going to be extremely durable. It's going to last a long time, but it's still fairly economical to build. Now this one, we've got 12 blocks across the back, and we come out about 4 blocks. You can see we've got them tapered in as they go. And then we've used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 T-posts just to kind of anchor it in there, keep it from sliding. No mortar. We didn't worry about anything like that. This is going to sit perfectly fine the way it is. And a setup like this, you can put together for about $200 in materials. So it's important to think about, when is our compost mature? It's good to know, when can I use this? When can I put it on my garden? There's several things we can do to tell when our compost is mature. The first thing is that you shouldn't be able to recognize most of the raw materials that went into it. Most of those raw materials are going to be broken down. It's going to have a black, very earthy look to it, just look like a good humus. And so that's one thing to think about. Another is the smell. The smell should be just that of a nice, rich, earthy aroma. It shouldn't have any off odors to it. And the temperature is very important on the compost pile. Whenever we turn our compost, we're adding that oxygen back to the middle of the pile. It's going to increase that temperature. So once we get past that high temperature phase, we know that the compost pile has used up most of the available nitrogen, and probably the composting process is about complete. A very useful tool is just a common oven thermometer that we can place down in the compost, and whenever the compost won't heat up higher than about 120 degrees, you know that your compost is pretty much ready to go, and it's going to be a very good usable product.